Hello and welcome to the second episode of this series of the Tyndale House podcast, in which we're talking about William Tyndale and his legacy. My name's Tony Watkins. I'm the Fellow for Public Engagement here at Tyndale House in Cambridge, and I'm delighted to have you join me again for this episode. 2026 marks the 500th anniversary since the publication of William Tyndale's New Testament, the first ever to be translated into English from Greek. In episode 1, we explored some of the story of Bible translation leading up to William Tyndale and the intellectual climate in which Tyndale was studying in Oxford when he was training to become a priest. Today we'll be talking about his life up to the point at which he published his New Testament in 1526, and then in the third and final episode of part 1 of this series, we will explore the latter part of Tyndale's life and his martyrdom, as well as his legacy, which extends well beyond the 16th century, even down to our own time. Later on in 2026, we'll do another short series looking at Bible translation today and some of the people who continue in the tradition of William Tyndale. To recap William Tyndale's story so far, he was born in Gloucestershire, England around 1494, and he studied at Oxford University under the name of William Hitchens. That's not because he was concealing his identity, but we know the family used both surnames, probably as a result of a significant second marriage. It's difficult to find hard evidence of various aspects of Tyndale's life, because there just aren't records still surviving today, 5 centuries later. Here's Alec Ryrie, Professor of the History of Christianity at the University of Durham.
Well, I mean, of course, we know frustratingly little about Tyndale's real personal background. There are some tantalizing hints, and an enormous amount of ingenuity has gone into piecing together some of the details of his early biography. Many of these ideas, I think, are very tempting, but I'm reluctant to put too much weight on them.
We do know some things, and we can make reasonable guesses about others.
You can, if you squint hard and with the eye of faith, see in Tyndale's background a couple of things which might have pushed him in a particular direction and given him a particular enthusiasm for the work of translation, which becomes so central to his life. One is the fact that he grows up on the Anglo-Welsh borderlands, which means that he is on one of the sharpest linguistic disjunctures anywhere in Western Europe. It's not quite as if he'd grown up on the borderlands of the Basque Country, but it has something of that quality to it. So he's dealing with linguistic neighbors who are, this is not a dialect. This is a profoundly different language with different structures and grammar. For all that there's a shared alphabet.
Growing up near the border with Wales probably set William Tyndale up to become a good linguist, and he eventually became fluent in Latin, French, German, Spanish, and of course Greek and Hebrew. And the area, as we said last time, was also a centre for the Lollards, the followers of John Wycliffe, so it's very likely that their ideas shaped Tyndale.
Did Tyndale ever come across Lollards and their translations? I mean, I think it's pretty clear there's no direct textual influence of the Wycliffite translation on his work. But I think growing up in Gloucestershire, he would have had to have been, strangely inattentive to his surroundings, to have not known that these people were out there.
William Tyndale studied to become a priest in Magdalen Hall, Oxford, now Hertford College, where he encountered the views of Christian humanists, including Erasmus.
Oxford is not a nest of radicals in this period. There's a cohort of them who are caught up with Erasmus's ideas, who are wanting to think of a radical simplification of the Christian life, who are wanting to open it up to a wider circle of lay people than had been the case before. And to that extent, they are standing in a long tradition running right through the medieval period, in which successive reforms have taken the Christian life from the monastic heart to which it had retreated in the wake of the collapse of Rome, and brought it further and further out into the life of the world. And so you've seen this through the mendicant movements in the 13th century, and then the Beguinages and the Devotio Moderna and the lay pieties of the 14th and 15th century, and the great Renaissance humanists, Erasmus most prominent amongst them, are pushing for a further expansion still. So in that sense, there's a real continuity with the medieval tradition, while also challenging what they see as corrupt or flawed or failed about it. And of course, there is nothing more authentically medieval than to be pressing for reformatio in that kind of a way.
Tyndale was in Oxford until 1517. According to his leading biographer, Professor David Daniel, who founded the Tyndale Society, he was probably at the University of Cambridge for some time between 1517 and 1521. There's no surviving record of him in the Cambridge archives, disappointingly, so the only evidence for this comes from Fox's Book of Martyrs, published in 1563. But Daniel says, in view of what is so often said about Lutherans in Cambridge in the early 1520s, the idea of Tyndale spending a period there seems so natural that surely it can only be an accident that his name does not appear in the records. Tyndale continued to be influenced by Christian humanism, and by Erasmus in particular after he left Oxford. In 1516, Erasmus had published his Novum Instrumentum, a New Testament with the Greek on one side and his own Latin translation on the other side. Simon Burton, the John Lang Senior Lecturer in Reformation History at the University of Edinburgh, talks about the influence of Erasmus on Tyndale.
Tyndale very much encountered that. We think it had a major impulse towards his conversion to Protestantism, and certainly it had a major impulse for his biblical translation. Just after Oxford, possibly Cambridge, we don't know, he may have been there, but after university he was a tutor to a knight in Gloucestershire, and for that knight, Sir John Walsh, he translated Erasmus's work, the Enchiridion, which was like a Christian manual. So we know that he translated that.
Tyndale was chaplain and tutor for the family of Sir John Walsh, a wealthy landowner at Little Sodbury Manor from 1521. Tyndale went out open-air preaching around the area, including in Bristol, and that got him into trouble with the local clergy. He was summoned to appear before the Chancellor of the Bishop of Worcester, who claimed that we had better be without God's laws than the Pope's, to which Tyndale allegedly famously replied, "I defy the Pope and all his laws, and if God spares my life ere many years, I will cause the boy that driveth the plough to know more of the Scriptures than thou dost." By 1523, Tyndale was determined to translate the New Testament into English, and he travelled to London to seek permission from the Bishop of London, Cuthbert Tunstall. Carl Gunter, historian of the Reformation from the University of Florida, says,
My understanding is I think it's in 1523 that he goes to London, and with the hope that Tunstall will, as the Bishop of London, will support his translation work. And I think he has good reason to think this. Tunstall is an associate of Erasmus's. He's a very learned man. It's a plausible hypothesis that Tunstall might support this, and Tunstall does not, but also is not sort of pointedly nasty to Tyndale, but he just doesn't support it.
Alec Ryrie explains why William Tyndale's request is so significant and why it would be Tyndale who makes it.
When Tyndale, as this bright young Erasmian scholar, shows up in London in the early 1520s to ask Erasmus's great friend Cuthbert Tunstall, the Bishop of London, for permission to break that long-standing anti-Lollard rule that translations into English shouldn't be permitted. I mean, this is unusual. Most European languages, most of Europe, there's no restriction on vernacular translations of the Bible. It's only because of the particular history of Lollardy in England that rule's in place. that he's able to go to Tunstall and say, surely times have changed. And nowadays, amongst gentlemen and scholars such as ourselves, I'm not like those carrot crunchers back in Gloucester. I can produce something of the kind that Erasmus, your friend, my hero, would have approved of. You can see why a man of his background might have found that idea particularly appealing. And so of all the different Erasmian scholars, the ones excited by evangelical theology, you can understand why of all of them it might be William Tyndale is the one who comes up with this innocent sounding, frankly naive suggestion.
Tyndale spent about a year in London, during which time he would have discovered that even if Bishop Tunstall had given him permission, London was not a good place to have a New Testament printed, as Carl Gunter explains.
And so Tyndale spent some time then in London, and it's clear that he's not going to have the chance to do it here. I think not only because it's illegal, but also, where would he find a printer in London to do this? There are also some real practical problems. I don't remember which historian wrote this, but said something along the lines of, two of them couldn't and one of them wouldn't. That you just don't have the infrastructure. There's a much more robust printing world in Europe. So, part of the thing that's really the reason why being on the continent is so valuable is partly because of the printing infrastructure.
While he was in London, it's likely that William Tyndale had contact with German merchants in the so-called Steel Yard. That was the London trading post for the Hanseatic League, nothing at all to do with steel. These merchants were bringing Lutheran texts into England, and Tyndale could easily have encountered those texts and Luther's ideas there if he hadn't done so before in Cambridge. Simon Burton says that there were plenty of opportunities for Luther's ideas and his New Testament to come to Tyndale's attention at that time.
I mean, he'd have been in London at exactly the time that Cardinal, or later Cardinal Fisher and Sir Thomas More were refuting Luther. But also, if he has these Lollard connections, there were lots of London merchants who were linked into what was happening in Germany. And in Lollard circles, Luther was eagerly taken up and read. And just as we know, Tyndale was later read in the same circles and circles of his kind of friends. So there are quite a lot of points where Luther could have where he would have met Luther, I think, before he went to Germany. But in Germany, he was in Lutheran cities at various times. We know that. So he would have been exposed directly to it as well.
Tyndale also met Humphrey Monmouth, a businessman in the cloth trade, who, perhaps with other merchants in London, gave him financial support. That enabled Tyndale to move to Germany in spring 1524, where he could access the latest linguistic scholarship and far better printers than any he could find in London. Bruce Gordon, the Titus Street Professor of Ecclesiastical History at Yale Divinity School and author of the Bible, A Global History, explains that the technology is a really important element in this pivotal moment.
And indeed, Luther's Bible is printed in vast numbers and reaches audiences and markets that was inconceivable in the preprint world. So they understand, just as people do today, through apps and electronic versions, the possibilities of the Bible, for the Bible, of changing technology. And Luther, Erasmus, and Tyndale, just to take those three, were masters of the technology. They knew how to use its possibilities. Tyndale is in that sense part of this.
Tyndale may have gone to Wittenberg for a time, but it's at least likely that it was while he was in Germany that he mastered Hebrew and connected with various reformers. Here's Simon Burton again.
After it became clear he couldn't translate the New Testament in England, wouldn't get permission, and perhaps it wasn't a congenial environment, obviously, he actually went to Germany. Now, there's been long thought that he may have gone to Luther's Wittenberg and studied there. There's no conclusive evidence. Some of his close associate in Bible translation did matriculate there, and someone else he was closely associated with. And there's a kind of mysterious William who may be him, but if it's him, it's under definitely an assumed name. So we have no proof. But what we do know is that when he first began to translate the New Testament, he was heavily reliant on Luther as well as on the original Greek text. The Luther September Testament of 1522 he was using for his kind of clone fragment of 1525. He drew on Luther's marginal notes. He drew on preface from Luther, although he expanded it and developed it in his own directions. And then subsequently he also was inspired by one of his other works. The Parable of the Wicked Mammon is an expansion of a sermon by Luther. So Luther was a major contact point for Tyndale. And he was often treated as an English Lutheran, especially by his opponents.
By late 1525, Tyndale had translated the New Testament into English, the first time that it had been translated from Greek rather than Latin. And he began printing them in Cologne.
Did you know that you can visit the Tyndale House Library in Cambridge? It's a specialist biblical studies library that welcomes scholars from across the globe. Tyndale House is a research centre with one of the world's most advanced libraries for biblical scholarship. Its collection includes around 60,000 print volumes and a growing range of electronic resources, mostly focused on the language, culture, history and meaning of the Bible. But what really makes Tyndale House special is the community. Whether you're a seasoned academic, a church leader, or a student still figuring it all out, the library invites you into a warm international group of scholars. It's a place where people from around the world come together to study, explore, and grow. And it is conveniently located 10 minutes walk from Cambridge University Library and 5 minutes from the Divinity faculty.
Why not come and experience it for yourself? Visit Tyndale House, spend some time with the resources, meet the community and see what makes it such a unique place to study.
As Alec Ryrie says, 1525 was a very significant year for the Reformation in England, although things were developing for a few years before that, which is, of course, precisely why Tyndale was doing this work.
The canonical starting point for the English Reformation in England is in Cambridge, and it's on Christmas Eve, 1525. So, the same year as Tyndale has already translated the New Testament, is getting it put into, so he is that much ahead of the game before people like Robert Barnes, who's the one who helps to really kick things off in Cambridge, Thomas Bilney, and then a series of others, Hugh Latimer, and then Thomas Cranmer coming along some way behind the rest without often direct connections to them, before they really become leading figures. So Tyndale is a step and a half ahead of the rest of these people. And one of the great unanswered, and I think unanswerable questions about Tyndale's career is at the point where he approaches Tunstall to say, how about it? Let's do a translation. Is this because he has already encountered some of the evangelical ideas, not of Erasmus but of Martin Luther? Some of those more strikingly proto-Protestant ideas that are coming out of the turmoil that's unfolding in Germany? Or is he, my own instinct is to say no, that's at this point, he'll have been aware of it because he wasn't living in a barn, but he is still, it seems to me, working within that Erasmian frame, in which it makes sense for him to approach Erasmus's friend the bishop and ask for permission. So I mean, the question is, when he asks for permission, is it mischievous or is it naive? And I'm inclined towards naivety. But it has to be said, there is already a murmuring of a presence of these ideas in London. And I mean, there are three great events, three sort of iconic moments in 1525. One is Tyndale's own attempted publication, of course. The second is Barnes's Christmas Eve sermon in Cambridge that I mentioned. The third is the raid on the Steel Yard, the centre for German merchants in London, where Thomas More gets wind of the fact that there are Lutheran texts being circulated here. I mean, as you might expect amongst an expatriate community of Germans. So that's the first point at which the English regime really gets a hint. No, this isn't just something that's happening somewhere else. There'd been a formal book burning in London in 1521, where the bishops assemble to make this great public statement of England's loyalty to the old church. But it's essentially staged for the foreign ambassadors. This is the Henry VIII who has written his Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, who has managed to negotiate this splendid title for himself from the Pope after long years of trying to get a title of this kind, is determined to play the part. The audience for this event is the foreign ambassadors who are invited along. They have to buy in the books, especially from the continent, in order to burn them. So I mean that's pure theatre. When they stage a second book burning in 1525, that's for real. By that time, they're actually starting to get it. But of course, by that stage, Tyndale is already off, and if he hadn't been drawn into the world of what we can't quite yet call Protestantism, the world which Martin Luther had begun to bring into being, if he hadn't been part of that when he first approaches Bishop Tunstall, the rejection, which then leads him to say, no, instead of simply obeying what my bishop has told me, I'm going to follow through on this. And that means I'm going to go abroad to where I know this can be done. I mean, that's a remarkable decision. And it, by the point that his translation actually appears, and we don't know when and where he did the actual work, it's clear that he is no longer just a naive Erasmian, that he has become fully acquainted with the principles of Luther's theology, even if he's never straightforwardly a Lutheran.
That first printing in Cologne in 1525 only got as far as Matthew 22 when it was stopped by the authorities. Alec Ryrie suggests that it actually was not the best city to be trying to do this work in.
So the 1525 sheets are printed in Cologne. So one of the Prince Archbishoprics of the Holy Roman Empire, which in retrospect was possibly not the wisest place to go to, right under the nose of one of the highest profile Catholic princes of the German Empire. That's detected. He's forced to abandon those. It's surprising that we even have those sheets. And he moves upriver to the city of Worms, which had been made famous by the diet held there less than 5 years earlier, where Martin Luther's condemned. And it's, Worms has by this stage become, not a reliably evangelical city, because there's no such thing at that point, but clearly sympathetic to a place where Protestant printing is possible. Can't call it Protestant yet. And it's there that he's able to see a full edition of the New Testament through to publication.
That 1526 edition printed in Worms is the first complete New Testament to be published in English, translated from Greek. This is a hugely significant moment, and that's why we're celebrating the 500th anniversary of that New Testament this year. The print run may have been 1,000 copies, which is a very big print run for people printing by hand on Gutenberg-type presses. There was clearly an appetite for an English New Testament in England at the time.
And that's going to be the first of a series of editions. There's a number of them that are published over the following years, and ultimately he prepares a revised version that's lightly revised, that's published in 1534.
Tyndale was very much standing on the shoulders of Jerome, Wycliffe, Erasmus, and Luther. And Bruce Gordon explains why that matters.
He's very aware that he stands in this tradition, and it's important that it's a tradition. None of them ever wanted to be saying they were doing something new. New is not good. Innovation is not good. So a Jerome is an important figure because they say this is this enormous man of the church who devoted himself to putting scripture into the language of the people. That's what we're doing. They see themselves as in a tradition. They do not see themselves as revolutionary. They see themselves as doing what you should always have done. And that is have the word of God in the language of the people. So it's not for them a new idea that appears in, the early 1520s. They see Erasmus not as someone who has got a new idea for Christianity in that sense, but somebody who has recovered the essence of Christianity. So it's not about newness. Although both Tyndale and Luther and Erasmus understood that the new technology of the day, the printing press, created possibilities that never existed before. One of the things he shares with Luther, who is a significant influence on him, is this belief that it's not just a principle that the Bible should be in the language of the people. He really does it. Famously, Luther would slip into local pubs and into the village to hear how people really spoke. And Tyndale does not only does that, he creates an English Bible in the sense that he creates a Bible of a vernacular Bible in which he doesn't just translate it, but he translates it into the world of 16th century English culture, the way people spoke, the phrases they have. He's participating in a long tradition of Bible translation, which is not just moving from one language to another, but it's creating languages. The life of the Bible from right up to today was often central to the creation of languages. And for instance, in Armenian in the early stage, there was not a written version of Armenian until there was a Bible translation into Armenian. It became the foundation of a written language. That story. So in that sense, translation not as rendering from one thing to another simply, but as a generative, creative act of culture and language. That sets him apart in the sense of his extraordinary influence to this day in the English-speaking world. But certainly, he gave 16th century England a vernacular, religious imagination.
William Tyndale's 1526 New Testament was a defining moment in English history. Melvyn Bragg, longtime BBC broadcaster and a biographer of William Tyndale, says that Tyndale is the most important Englishman who has ever lived. Please join us again for our next episode when we'll discuss the tragic end of William Tyndale's life, and we'll also talk about his legacy, not just for the Reformation in England, but continuing on down to our own time.